Welcome back. I thought it might be helpful to start with at least a brief sidebar on the biblical notion of purity. I think it's easy for us at the chronological and cultural distance where we stand to look askance at these texts. Can I suggest that the biblical notion of purity, impurity, or clean, unclean is not necessarily, and often not at all, related to sin? What I'm trying to say is that according to Leviticus and the rest of the First Testament, something that's impure or unclean does not necessarily equal sinful, much as holy does not equal perfect. The Hebrew kadosh refers to someone or something that's being singled out, set apart, kept from the profane, awe-inspiring. Something kodesh is a thing set apart, something other. Now, God is perfect, all right, but the thrust of this notion of holiness is that He's wholly other. He's not nature. He's not one of us. He's not bound by our limitations. He's other. I think the tabernacle maybe gives us an image of what's going on in these purity codes. Think of it. What's at the very heart of the tabernacle? The Holy of Holies. Just the Hebrew superlative, like you've heard the phrase King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Song of Songs, Holy of Holies. This is the most holy place. And then what's just outside that? The holy place. Are you beginning to see? And then the court of the tabernacles. I realize those are probably, they are, rectangles. But imagine concentric circles. You got the bullseye, the core, and then the next circle, and then same center, but we keep going out. So you've got the court of the tabernacle. And then what? The camp of God's people. And then what? The Gentiles. And Leviticus gives us another set of concentric circles. The high priest, the priesthood, Israel, the Gentiles. You see, there seem to be two sets of concepts at work in the Torah regarding both persons and things. The first is this holy common dyad. If you think of them on a continuum, holy common. Then there's also clean and unclean. Now, someone or something can be holy and pure at the same time, say a priest. But someone or something can also be common and pure at the same time. Say a regular Israeli. But, and this is important, no one and no thing can be holy and unclean at the same time. So as I've tried to indicate before, listen, there's nothing sinful or dirty, for example, about birthing a baby. But birthing renders the mother ceremonially unclean. And the purification rituals are meant to teach and reinforce this idea of God's being wholly other. Professor Jacob Milgrom, in his work on Leviticus, offers, I think, some very helpful insights from a Jewish perspective. He also thinks in terms of these concentric circles that I mentioned a moment ago, and the high priest, and then the priest, and then Israel, and then the Gentiles. He suggests seeing what's happening in the dietary laws, where the holiest center is God Himself. And then the animals for sacrifice, and then a restricted list of animals for Israel's consumption. And then the outer circle representing all animals. He also argues, I think helpfully, that there are ethical reasons for Israel's dietary laws. Now, while eating meat is legitimate, the choice of animals is restricted for Israel. Do you notice that? Domesticated animals that are herbivores. And the animal was to be respected in the way that they were killed for food, and their blood was drained and buried. Now, it is possible, and some commentators want to suggest that, well, hygiene was the reason for these cleanliness or purity laws. And it may be an element, but I think just. It seems to me, Milgrom's right, that the main function is to set up a system whereby people will not be brutalized by killing animals for their flesh. The blood-life connection is significant. And here again, the Bible sets the chosen people apart from the surrounding societies. Milgrom notes that to us today, these instructions regarding the purity, impurity of animals and humans may sound bizarre. But he argues that there are symbols, or what I like to think of as object lessons, to the children's group at church. The object lessons that reveal deeper, basically ethical values that do remain relevant to us today. The other thing that I think is helpful to pay attention to is that in the biblical context and the biblical vision, impurity lies in the realm of death. And only life is its antidote. Life purges the sanctuary by nullifying and overpowering and absorbing the Israelites' impurities that adhere to it, allowing the divine presence to remain and Israel to survive. So, watch. If a woman cuts her finger and it bleeds, she's not unclean. But with her menses, she loses her ovum. Death. There's nothing sinful about the menses, but it does reinforce the sanctity of life and calls for ceremonial purification, not from sin, but this otherness. You know, this is quite a contrast with other ancient societies where the menstruant was taboo, and anything she touched could be imbued with potentially catastrophic demonic powers. And just a quick additional comment regarding the purity of food and clothing. Mary Douglas, another little bit of bibliography for you, in her book Purity and Danger, provides a thoughtful discussion and offers an insight that holiness is also exemplified by completeness. So, holiness requires that individuals shall conform to the class to which they belong, and that different classes of things shouldn't be confused. And so, yes, I wear garments that are, part cotton and part polyester, but part of what was being taught here was this idea of order and things supposed to be in its class. Well, enough of that for right now. Time is of the essence. So I want to think for a moment about chapter 16. And note that chapter 16 is in kind of a bullseye position. It's the centerpiece. I mean, you look at the structure of the book of Leviticus. I'm not talking about counting the numbers of chapters, but as you look at how the structure lays out, chapter 16 is the centerpiece. And the subject is what? Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement that links us back to the Exodus narrative, where those who were already in covenant relationship with Yahweh had to trust in God's promise that the death of the Passover lamb redeemed them, rescued them. Now, they could shrug it off or defiantly deny the promise, and the result would be fatal. You see, violating God's righteous expectations required coming to the point where I agreed with God that this was sin, and doing it about face, and it called for sacrifice. See, God's righteous expectations about His people being different meant that there was lots of opportunity to address how easy it was to conform to the rest of the world. This too required sanctification. Moses and Miriam and Aaron and all the others learned that walking in an intimate relationship with God and serving Him may put some limits on personal choice, but it's the way to go. Well, chapter 17, the style shifts back into legislation regarding moral and ceremonial impurity, 17, 18, 19, on to 24, verse 9, then 24:10, and into chapter 23, the narrative picks up again. And here we confront that eye for an eye expression. Have you ever wondered what's the point that's being made? Let me suggest to you we've got an example all the way back in Genesis. Remember in Genesis when we talked briefly about that arrogant, power-mad tyrant named Lamech, who boasts that he killed a man, calls him a boy. He killed him for wounding him. By golly, Lamech said, if God could avenge Cain 7 times, then Lamech was going to be avenged 490 times. Well, the point of this instruction in Leviticus is to teach that the punishment should fit the crime and not more. Then, chapters 25 through 27, back to legislation about the holy year, every 7th, the Holy Land, chapter 25, the restoration of the Jubilee year, followed by the concluding exhortations in chapter 26 and 27. So, how's Leviticus structured? First 16 chapters, approach to a holy God. What does it mean to be redeemed? Chapter 17 through 25, living with this holy God. What does it mean to be restored? Chapter 26, covenant blessings and cursings. And then last, instructions regarding vows in chapter 27. I don't know if it ever has struck you how important Leviticus' role is in Judaism. It's interesting that under the influence of A.J. Jacobs' book, The Year of Living Biblically, Dan Harrell on the staff of Park Street Church, Boston, did a full series of sermons on Leviticus. And in preparation for this sermon series, he and 21 of his congregants engaged in a 30-day experiment in living Levitically. This was written up in Christianity Today back in 2008. Worth taking a look at. The theme of the book of Leviticus, I think, is holiness, sanctification, another word for the same thing. See, as a unique, redeemed people, Israel is to keep holy and to approach God through this substitutionary atonement. In responding to the dangers of externalizing and formalizing, many Christians have fallen off the balance beam on the other side by just simply spiritualizing Leviticus. See, Leviticus gives tangible expressions. I mean, there's symbols and rituals that you can touch and taste and that reflect on the spiritual reality meant to be experienced by the believers. I think a parallel for us would be the bread and the wine. Symbols of a spiritual reality meant to be experienced by the believer. The teaching of Leviticus culminates in the person and the work of the Messiah. In the meantime, it teaches what it might look like for a believing community to live out biblical holiness in the presence of the God who is there. Think about it. We'll see you in a bit.